Dear students, welcome to the massive open online course on Political Economy 2. In today's module, we are going to learn about the Marxian crisis theory and the theory of the falling rate of profit. This module would help us to learn or understand the concept of economic crisis. We would like to explore how this crisis had precipitated or what has been the origin of this crisis. We would also explore the reasons for the tendency of profits to fall and understand the three variants of the Marxian crisis theory. Now, what is economic crisis? An economic crisis occurs when capitalists are unable to sell their commodities without incurring substantial losses, which would reverberate through the system in a chain of defaults, curtailing production in a cumulative downward spiral. So, the theoretical issue is to explain such a systematic market failure which leads to economic crisis. When we try to understand how the crisis precipitated, now this is an abstract possibility of crisis. It is already contained in the separation of the concept of purchase and sale, which is a feature of production and exchange of commodities for money in an economy. If a significant number of sellers withdraw their money from circulation rather than using it to buy further commodities, then the latter commodities will remain unsold in the economy. So, for political economy, such an outcome would be completely irrational since, as Adam Smith had put forth in this way, that consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. So, the purpose of selling one commodity would always be to buy another commodity. So, it really does not make sense if some commodities are left unsold. On contrast, Marx tells us that the sole end purpose of capitalist production is nothing but accumulation of capital through the production and the appropriation of surplus value. The sale of commodities represents the reconversion of the capitalist's expanded capital into the form of money with which to renew the process of capital accumulation. So the capitalists will devote some of the money realized to his own consumption, but the remainder will be reinvested provided only that there are opportunities for its profitable investment. So Marx identifies the conditions for crisis as the absence of such opportunities. Capitalists will withdraw their money from circulation if they cannot invest it profitably. Thereby, it will result or it will precipitate in a crisis for the economy. So, if we try to understand the origin of the economic crisis, we can say that it lies in the overproduction of commodities in relation to the effective demand at a price that makes it possible to realize the surplus value embodied in those commodities. But the question is, what is the source of such overproduction? This is the point at which Marx really parts company decisively with the political economy. Now, when we try to look at the notion of crisis and political economy, we find that for political economy, competition ensures that overproduction is liquidated through the movement of capital between various branches of production. We know the Say's law of markets, which guarantees that general overproduction is practically impossible. So, overproduction in one branch can only arise as a result of disproportionality with underproduction arising in some other branch. The rate of profit in the former branch will be lower and in the latter branch will be higher than the average. So capital in the latter branch will move to the former branch to restore equality of profit rates and also to restore the proportionality of production. However, if disproportionality reaches a certain stage of crisis, it can only be because overproduction has been sustained unnaturally by the speculative expansion of credit. So for political economy, therefore, a crisis was essentially a monetary phenomenon that arose as a result of inappropriately lax regulations by the monetary authorities. Now, when we look at the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, we find Marx himself calling this law as a most important law of modern political economy, the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Marx's own analysis of the laws of motion of capitalistic development led him to the formulation of this very important law. According to him, in the course of capitalistic development, there exists a tendency for live labor to be continuously replaced by dead labor. What do I mean by this? Capitalists basically replace workers by using more machinery. At the same time, the increased productivity of the labor process leads to an increased amount of raw material and auxiliary material processed in a given hour of labor. Thus, the amount of dead labor incorporated in the means of production like machinery, raw materials, and auxiliary material increases over time relative to the amount of live labor directly employed in the production process. And Marx expresses this development in what he calls the organic composition of capital, or OCC, that is, an increasing ratio of dead to live labor. This development, Marx argues, would lead to a tendency of the rate of profit to fall over time. Despite the existence of a number of counteracting forces, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall would assert itself as a continuous structural threat to the capitalist mode of production. On one hand, Marx clearly saw this tendency as a long-run development of the capitalist mode of production. So, it is in this sense directly related to the inherent dynamics of the process of capital accumulation. On the other hand, Marx puts great emphasis on linking up this tendency with a short-run crisis phenomenon. So Marx, he saw crisis as temporary breakdowns in capitalist accumulation process. Yet at the same time, he considered them to be a mechanism that recreates the preconditions for a profitable capital accumulation. So what turns out? That crises are basically an inherent part of the continued reproduction of capitalism. One effect of crisis is to reduce the rate at which real wages rise, or even to cause a decline in real wages. Furthermore, if we try to look at crisis further, it basically results in the devaluation of capital as well as its concentration and centralization. So it is precisely these effects which allows the accumulation process to continue by re-establishing profitable investment opportunities. We would now look at the expression for the rate of profit. As you can see on the screen, the expression of the rate of profit is denoted by rho. Rho is basically equal to pi by k, that is profit by capital, which is equal to pi by y into y by z into z by k. Now what does this mean? Now pi measures the volume of profits, while k measures the capital stock. Y measures the actual output or income, and z measures the potential output, or in other words, the capacity. Here, the rate of profit, which is defined as rho, is definitionally equal to the product of the share of profit in income. Now, we have said it is pi by y. Since pi represents profit and y represents the actual output, so pi by y basically represents the share of profits in the income into y by z. Y represents the actual output while z represents the potential output or capacity. So y by z basically represents the rate of capacity utilization in the economy, which is represented by psi. And we have here z by k. Z represents the capacity while k represents the capital stock. So z by k basically represents the capacity capital ratio, which is denoted by epsilon in the equation. So this I call it as equation number 1. So each of the 3 variants of the Marxian theory of crisis can be shown to focus on some of these different elements in equation 1, which would be the initial source of decline in the rate of profit. So now this is what we are going to check out. What are the different crisis theory of Marx and which of them act as the initial source of decline in the rate of profit. Now the first one, which we call the rising organic composition of capital, or in other words, in short, we call it ROC. This crisis theory was fully developed by Marx himself. It has been applied primarily to explain the long-run tendency of the rate of profit to fall, but it can also be adapted to explain the short-run cyclical fluctuations in the rate of profit. The ROC variant, is generally formulated within a Marxian value theoretic framework. So here we'll be using the standard notations. As you can again see in the slide that the standard labor value concepts are used. Here C denotes constant capital, V denotes variable capital, S denotes the surplus value. So basically we have the concept of G, which is nothing but constant capital divided by variable capital. So what is G? G is nothing but what Marx calls the organic composition of capital. E is basically the rate of exploitation. So E is equal to the surplus value divided by the variable capital. That means how much of surplus value has been generated in terms of the variable capital. And R is the value rate of profit. So it is S by C plus V. So if I divide both the numerator and the denominator here by V, what we get is S by V divided by C by V plus V by V. So S by V divided by C by V plus 1. We have already said that S by V is basically E, that is the rate of exploitation, divided by C by V plus 1. C by V was nothing but the organic composition of capital, which we had called it as G. So ultimately we get another equation here where we say that the value rate of profit is basically equal to the rate of exploitation divided by the organic composition of capital plus 1. This we call it as equation 2. The essential hypothesis of the rising organization of capital variant is that the capitalist process of accumulation sooner or later generates an increase in the organic composition of capital. It has been further hypothesized that the rate of exploitation does not change appreciably. So if I look at equation 2, we can see that if G rises, that is G is in the denominator, if it rises and if the rate of exploitation does not change much, if it is constant, then the whole fraction, that is E by G plus 1, is going to fall, and this will result in a fall in the value of the rate of profit R. So you see the tendency of the rate of profit falling is explained from here. If I look at equation 1 And if I try to put the ROC variant in the equation 1 and try to relate it with equation 1, we find that if we take an assumption of a constant epsilon, that is pi by w, and also sigma pi, which is equal to rate of profit by the rate of output, and sigma w, which is basically equal to w by y, if we assume all these three variables to be constant, the ROC variant, we also find it does not hinge on the development of excess capacity. So the rate of capacity utilization, that is psi, which was given to us by y by z, that will also be assumed or presumed to be constant. We find that gamma, which is equal to k by w, there has been a hypothesized rise in gamma because the capacity by capital ratio, which is basically epsilon in equation 1, it will cause it to fall. And this follows from the constancy of relative shares and the rate of capacity utilization. So gamma, which I say is basically k by w, I can write this k by w in a more simplified form by writing it as k by z into z by y into y by w. So you see, it's a very simple thing. K by z is nothing but the inverted thing of epsilon. Epsilon was z by k, so k by z is 1 by epsilon. We had y by z in equation 1. Now here we have z by y, which means this is 1 by psi. And also in equation 1, we had w by y. Here we have y by w, which essentially means it is 1 by sigma w. So this is equation 4 for us. So thus, according to the ROC variant of the Marxian crisis theory, it is a fall in the third term in equation 1. So what is the third term in equation 1? It is epsilon. It is z by k. It is a fall in this third term that constitutes the initial source of decline in the rate of profit. So this, we are done with the first variant of the Marxian crisis theory. The second variant of the Marxian crisis theory is called the rising strength of labor. This is based on the thesis of the rising strength of labor, which focuses on the gains by the working class in its struggle with the capitalist class. The principal hypothesis of this variant is that the capitalist process of accumulation tends to alter the balance of the political economic power between labor and capital in such a way so as to enable the working class to increase the wage share of the national income. So if I look at sigma w was share of profit by the total level of output or income, so pi by y, which can be written in other words as, pi can be written as y minus w divided by y. So it is basically 1 minus w by y. W by y was basically sigma w. So we have it as 1 minus sigma w. So the profit share can be expressed as above. The hypothesized rise in wage share will squeeze the profit share. Thus, the RSL variant points to a fall in the first term in equation 1 as the initial source of decline in the rate of profit. No prior fall in either the rate of capacity utilization or the capacity capital ratio is assumed to occur. So while in the first variant, the organic composition of capital variant, we found the culprit to be the last or the third term, that is epsilon, that is z by k. In the second one, in the rising strength of labor, we find that the first term of the equation, that is sigma pi, as the initial source of decline in the rate of profit. We would now like to look at the reasons for the growth in the working class power. The reasons that has been advanced for the growth in the working class power differ somewhat in the cyclical and longer run versions of the RSL variant. The cyclical version rests on the notion of a periodic depletion of the reserve army of labor. As a cyclical expansion develops, the demand for labor grows more rapidly than the supply, and the reserve army is depleted and the labor market tightens. The growing scarcity of labor is then hypothesized to increase its political economic power. They try to improve their bargaining position of the workers vis-a-vis the capitalist. This line of argument is well grounded theoretically. Unemployment rates do indeed decline during the cyclical expansion, and it is quite plausible to suggest that tight labor markets do improve the bargaining position of the workers, although the balance of power between labor and capital is surely affected by many other factors. The hypothesis of a rise in the working class power in a longer term context cannot so readily be grounded in a secular depletion of the reserve army. For in the long run, one might expect with Marx that the reserve army would be replenished by a periodic economic downturn, by labor-saving technological change, or by new sources of the labor supply. So, the following three propositions have been advanced by the RSL theorists. Number one, an increase in the working class power enables the workers to bargain more successfully for higher wages and thereby to increase the rate of growth of the money wages. Secondly, an increase in the working class power enables the workers to resist more successfully the efforts of the capitalist to increase the work intensity via increased discipline or speed-ups or other measures designed to increase labor efficiency units per hour of work. Third, the rise in the unit labor cost, which will sooner or later result from accelerating wages and or decelerating productivity, will not be offset by a corresponding increase in output prices. So as a consequence, the share of wages will rise. The first two propositions which has been put forward here are possible. But the third one is a more controversial one. It runs counter to arguments put forward by more famous economists like Kalecki, Rothorn, etc. And the third basic variant of the Marxian crisis theory is the realization failure. It differs from the first two in that it focuses on the sphere of circulation rather than the sphere of production. The threat of profitability is precipitated in the ROC variant by rising capital cost, while in the RSL variant, it is precipitated by rising labor cost. The threat to profitability in the third variant stems from difficulties in selling the produced commodities at profitable prices. So this is a problem here. At prices that cover the costs incurred as well as the expected profit margin. If they are unable to sell at that prices, it results in this type of crisis. In Marxian terminology, the problem is that demand conditions prevent the capitalists from realizing the full value of the commodities produced. And hence, this variant is based on the thesis of a realization failure and will be labeled as, we call it, the RF variant of the Marxian crisis. The basic hypothesis of this variant of Marxian crisis theory is that the capitalist process of capital accumulation tends to generate an imbalance in which the demand for commodities lags behind the capacity to produce commodities. The resulting inadequacy of demand obliges the capitalists to restrain either their production level or their output prices, lest they add involuntarily to their inventories of unsold output. Given institutional constraints on price reduction that operates in many sectors of the contemporary capitalist economies, capitalists can be expected to deal with such problems, such inadequate demand, primarily by cutting back production and consequently lowering the average rate of capacity utilization in the economy as a whole. So, the RA variant singles out a fall in equation 1 in the second term. The second term is the psi term, that is y by z, a fall in the y by z as the initial source of decline in the rate of profit. So this is as a result of underconsumption. So the logic of the underconsumption thesis in either a long run or short run context runs from a declining wage share to a slowdown in consumption demand to a fall in aggregate demand relative to productive capacity. Long-run versions of the thesis attribute a secular decline in the share of wages to a growing degree of monopoly power in advanced capitalist economies. A slowdown in consumption demand is in turn assumed to restrain the growth of aggregate demand because the other main sources of spending, like investment demand, is essentially a derived demand, ultimately depends on the growth of consumption. So it should be noted that the decline in the wage share that initiates the fall in consumption leads by itself to a rise in the share of profits. Thus, the ultimate decline that occurs in the rate of capacity utilization must be assumed to be greater in its impact on the profit rate than any continued rise in the profit share. So, to conclude this comparative discussion of the three basic variants of the Marxian crisis theory, I should caution against viewing them solely as competing alternatives, because in Marx's own thinking, they were dynamically interrelated. One process of decline in the rate of profit could be expected to lead in a dialectical manner to an ameliorative response that would in turn initiate another process of decline. Now, which of these three variants, the ROC variant, the RSL variant, or the RF variant, has manifested itself more strongly in particular historical periods of profit rate decline? It is not very much possible to tell. But it is possible for more than one of these three variants to operate simultaneously as well as sequentially to depress the rate of profit. The effort to determine how significant each variant has been can contribute to an understanding of an actual decline in the rate of profit, and it can thereby provide a very useful empirical foundation for current debates amongst the Marxian theorists of economic crisis.